Okay, we are live. Joining me this early morning for some, not so early for others, but for some of us. Joining me this morning, a very special guest, Maja Spener. Maja, thank you for joining me this morning. I hope it's not too early there.
Not for me.
Yeah, not for you, exactly. Great. Well, I wonder if before we get started this morning, if you could tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do for those who might not know you.
Yeah, great. Thanks for having me on. So I'm a philosopher working at the University of Birmingham in the UK. And my main interest has been on introspection. But I look at that specifically in the context of how that's used in various kinds of theorizing about the mind. And what that means is that my work sort of falls in intersections of different areas: philosophy of science and philosophy of cognitive science, philosophy of mind, epistemology. Um, and growing out of that work, I have increasingly strong interests in the history of psychology
Hmm.
and the nature of abilities and on the science of metacognition. Of course, still on sort of introspection in the philosophy of mind and self-knowledge, but these other areas are growing in sort of focus now.
Interesting. Okay. Um, yeah, and so it's been 2 years since your book on introspection came out. Is that it's
In the beginning
2023?
of 2004, 2024. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, so it's only been a year. Okay.
Yeah.
Um, Relatively recent. Well, it's a great book. I hope that people read it and that it gets a good reception. I enjoyed reading it, so I thought it was very thorough and well written. Take you through it in a way that's easy to understand. And one of the things that you mentioned at the beginning, and that you just mentioned currently right now, that I wanted to kind of bring up at the beginning, was the early psychologists. Because in your standard textbook psychology intro class, you often find a story about them that you want to clear the record on or
Yeah.
set it a bit straight. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what that story is and how you aim to correct the standard story.
Okay. Yeah, that is an important, um, I guess, endeavor of mine to do that. Partly because it's a very, very interesting area
Hmm.
of psychology and philosophy. And what I'm talking about is sort of the 19th century, really. But that's I'm only restricting it, and the early 20th. I'm only restricting it that way because that's as far as I got.
Yeah.
And so I would like to go back further.
Okay.
Um, and I have looked mainly at psychology in Germany with a little bit, again, that there needs, I feel the need to expand out to the other, all the other European and countries in America, especially, also
Hmm.
some of Russia. But so the standard narrative I'm sure everybody is familiar with is that there were these introspectionist psychologists that just went and asked themselves, oh, what is the mind like? So let me introspect a little bit and let me train myself to really be good at it by just doing more of it. And then here's my theory. And what you find actually is an incredible sophistication and modern way of approaching work using introspection.
Hmm.
So much so that I think that we should, in order to theorize with introspection, we should look to these people, to this body of work, to really find. Obviously, technology has moved on, but we can find just theoretical distinctions or tricks of the trade that have been developed that are perfectly in line with work that is done today, and that would be helpful and enriching to look at. So I don't know how much detail to give, but because there's just so much of it, and I'm interested now just in the. I'm just interested as a more from a historical point of view, just in itself in this area. But one thing that strikes me is that these psychologists were also often philosophers,
Mm-hmm.
and they were well versed in, all of the philosophy that went on in philosophy of science as well as in philosophy of mind, such as it was. And so you have just a very rich conception. These people thought hard about what is psychology as distinct from philosophy, as distinct from physiology, and what is the theoretical framework that we're bringing to investigating the mind? What is observation supposed to tell us?
Right.
And there were different views about that. And they all sort of got discussed and worked out in adversarial discussions about this. So yeah, I could say more, but
Well, I mean, one of the things
yeah.
that I want you to say a little bit more about is the general theme of the unreliability of introspection and the kind of downfall of introspectionist psychology, often in the textbooks, due to
I
the,
see.
the rise
Yeah.
of behaviorism, where it doesn't really seem when you really pay attention to the actual history of what happened that there was this kind of mass disarray, confusion about the method, and then an abandonment of it because of the rigorous demands of scientific methodology or something like that, which is the sort of standard part of the standard picture, I think.
Yeah. So what I do in the book, and I say that I do that sort of in developing it by finding it reflected very much in this early period of
Mm-hmm.
psychology, is distinguishing between two senses of introspection. One is the introspection as a type of first person access or types of a kind of first person access, a mental capacity,
Mm-hmm.
and introspection as an inquiry, where why is it an introspective inquiry, an introspective method? It's because it deploys some of those introspective mental capacities in whatever carrying out the inquiry or the investigation.
Mm-hmm.
And the early psychologists, especially people like Wilhelm Wundt, really were very good, but also William James, for example, very good at distinguishing these two senses. It didn't always sort of leap off the page, but when you look at how they did things, they thought that what they were doing is carrying out this method, this inquiry, this scientific inquiry, using introspection. But when it came to the method, there was so much more to introspection as
Mm-hmm.
method than just the deployment of this mental capacity. And in particular, they drew attention to there being different types of those that you could use. You
Mm-hmm.
could use a form of attention, uh, introspectively attending to your ongoing conscious situation. You could use retrospection,
Mm-hmm.
so a form of memory, or this other thing that typically is associated with Brentano, a kind of um, non-focal side awareness, peripheral awareness. You could exploit that as well in trying to gather this data in psychology. They all felt that we needed to use some form of first-person access, some form of introspective access. And then they were very good at thinking about how you might put together a particular form of a particular method where you're using a particular introspective access, form or type of introspective access. And depending on what your goal was, your target was, you'd need to have the experimental setup in the right way to support and compensate weaknesses
Mm-hmm.
or bring out strength of this particular type of introspective access. So there were, of course, also people, especially following on from Wundt, some of his students which are the kind of the much more the people we're thinking of today when we're having this caricature of the introspectionists who basically did much more this qualitative. They ask you to, hey, focus on, for example, answer this question about ancient. They were also cultured something about the ancient Greeks. Think about the ancient Greeks in these ways. Now tell me, how did this thought go? And then there would be a half an hour conversation about, and so this kind of gathering of qualitative reports was then thought to be what introspectionists did, but actually that was just one type that was also criticized greatly by others in the field. So you have actually people like Wundt, they're much more psychophysicists than what we now standardly think of as introspectionists.
Yeah, that's interesting. I want to, just by way of a parenthesis here, I wonder about this other kind of standard line that you find in the intro textbooks. So often they'll contrast like William James as a functionalist about them. He's interested in questions about what the function of the mind could be, as opposed to the introspectionists who were trying to understand the fundamental elements of the mind and how they fit together, which might even be distinguished from the Gestalt psychologists who were interested in a different question altogether. So do you think that part of the Sanders story holds up? And it's just this question about the introspectionist that gets muddled, or is it a general feature? Or do you not know? I wonder. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Okay, so I think parts of this story pick up on trends. And in particular, you have so one dividing line in this period is the increasing influence of the positivists on doing science more generally, but also on especially doing psychology. And you have two competing pictures that play out in these different views, and where the Gestalt theorists and people like that fall on one side and other people fall on another side. And the two pictures are what you might call the explanatory picture of science and the descriptive picture of science. So the descriptive picture is the positivists who think that, and this concerns what observation is supposed to do for you. And if you're a psychologist, what introspective observation is supposed to do for you. So the descriptive picture says that you're not to bring theory to what observation tells you, but everything must be derived from observation, theory too. So theory can go beyond what you can observe, and that means that, and it is the radical empiricist positivist thought that the scientific theory in the end, or psychological theory in the end, is a very economical summary of the regularities and functional relationships that you find in observation, in experience. And that's contrasted with the so-called explanatory or more speculative picture, where you observe and then you explain. The idea is that you causally explain what you observe, the regularities, by positing something that causally explains what's going on there. But where your theory really can go beyond what you're strictly observing.
So like cognitive science is an example of this.
Of which side?
Of the side where you're positing something to explain what you're observing, going beyond.
That's right. I mean, I think nowadays, we're not radical empiricists, positivist empiricists anymore. Though I think the echoes of that really do hang around sometimes in some weird ways. And that is an interest of mine, looking at the history to then bring those questions to contemporary theorizing and ask what the background conception is here that underlies the connection between observation and theory. But Wilhelm Wundt, for example, was on the explanatory side,
Mm-hmm.
and he was superseded by his students, who became more and more taken by the descriptive side. But then you have there too strands that grow apart, where there's influences from, say, Brentano, which is the James kind of is more in line with that, I think.
Right.
And the later Oswald Küper and the Würzburg school, they are in line with a kind of descriptive picture, but rejecting what Titchener went on to do, which was the sensational atomist conception of psychology. So there you have really two strands that differ from Wundt again, who was really just a straightforward, much more, as I said, he's quite modern, right?
Right. Yeah.
Um,
He's interested
and
just in reaction times and things of that nature.
absolutely, and but also in terms of how he thought, um, how restricted he was about what introspective observation could deliver.
Mm-hmm.
For him, what it could deliver was good description of the phenomena to be explained, and then constraints on theorizing, where you develop your theory and apply it always in line with observational data. But he didn't think that you needed to derive in fact, he thought that was silly to
Mm-hmm.
derive the theory itself from the observation. But so the interesting bit about the other side, that's kind of what superseded Wundt in the end, this descriptive sweep of the positivists. On the one hand, it was Titchener, who I think he's responsible for a lot of what people think now about introspectionists, because he wanted to say that what we want to do is explain complex psychological phenomena in terms of very basic sensory elements,
Right.
sensational elements, where you could introspect these and then see how they combined to form the more complex
Right.
psychological phenomena. And one reason why he did that was because he was a reductivist, and wanted to, in the end, discharge sort of experience in being able to account for the sensory elements or sensational elements in terms of physiological underlying physiological processes. So you would really have absorbed psychology into physiology and then downwards. So that was one aim, and
And so that this is a part of the source of the debate over imageless thoughts.
that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And that went then with Cooper, where Cooper rejected this idea of elementism.
Mm-hmm.
And I can say something later if you want about Wundt also shared a certain elementism, but it was very, very, very different from Titchener's view, much more sensible in a way. But but so inspired by Brentano and also then going into the Gestalt theorists, you have people like Kuhlbe focusing just on different aspects of experience, not on the basic sort of sensory or perceptual elements, but he wanted to think of more higher cognitive elements like judgment and thought.
Mm-hmm.
And didn't think that you could do this reductive thing at all. Yet, hanging on to the descriptive picture of thinking you don't want to draw your theory from outside what experience gives you in what you can obtain in observation. And that's how you get a lot of the kind of positing these things just into the experience as something introspectable in some way.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Wundt never did any of that.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So why then? I mean, I guess I have a couple of questions. One that I can't help asking, but that's kind of an aside, is about why these guys thought that sensations were a part of physiology as opposed to psychology, whereas now I would assume that we think that sensation is, as the beginning of perception, as you know, this process that begins when sensation ends with perception, are both squarely within the purview of psychology and the cognitive sciences. So, why did they think it was physiology? Is this? Yeah, I'm not. Yeah, why did they? Why did
Okay,
they think that?
so I'm not quite sure about exactly the theory that they had,
Okay.
but the idea is just that if you get experience analyzed into very simple components that seem not further analyzable in terms of what you can introspect, and what you've reached the atoms of experience,
Yeah.
and these are very, very simple sensory elements, then it's just the thought that, look, we will be able to at some point reduce these to something physiological,
Uh huh.
right? So
But they didn't think the higher level stuff itself could be reduced to something physiological just directly.
well, no, no, and I mean that's the business of psychology, right? You show how the higher level stuff comes about in terms of how it's put together from the simple components plus principles of combination or synthesis.
Okay.
And that picture, I mean, and again, that's not so wild, right? I mean, in the end, that kind of basic idea, we do that all the time. We want to explain what something is that seems a compound in terms of the simpler elements and how they're put together.
Right.
Um, and Wundt shared that picture very much. It's just that he thought that introspection wasn't going to deliver to you these simple elements. They were going to be a matter of abstraction,
Right.
and posits in the end that you would get via exact observation, introspective observation, but you couldn't glean them from the observation itself, right there. Whereas Titchener thought your training introspective training was going to help you to get through the naive overlay down onto the sheer
Right.
bottom,
The
basic
bedrock.
level of experience. Nothing like that was true for Wundt. He didn't think that you could do that, but if introspective observation delivered data to you that helped you maybe isolate and abstract, but via a kind of abstraction, what these basic elements would be. But he was more interested in the principles of combination, and there he had really interesting views. He liked Mill's analogy, the mental chemistry that's often mentioned.
Yeah.
He liked that very much. And he thought that there was something very right about it, in that you had to think about the basic components, sensory components, sensational components, as being put together in a way where you can have properties emerging at the complex level or compound level that weren't had by the elements. And so that's like in chemistry, you have whatever, an alkane, propane, made from hydrogen and carbon,
Right.
right? And so propane has properties that aren't had by either hydrogen or carbon, but it's how they're put together, how they bond, that means that that propane gets to have those properties. Where he disagreed with Mill really took that quite seriously and thought you could still derive those higher level properties in some sense from the properties had by the lower level. And how they combine, whereas Wundt was open to thinking that there are some what he called creative syntheses.
Like that truly emergent properties in the sense that they cannot be analyzed in terms of their base.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I think, so I haven't looked at this debate yet. That's I think Eric Mandelbaum and people like that talk about, associationism
Yeah.
versus other ways. So that debate went on there too. The empiricists were much more straightforwardly just associationists, whereas Wundt wanted to. This is very hard for a German, by the way. W and V's in succession, but anyway.
Yeah. Well, we don't know how to say it either. So Vunt is fine with me.
It's just that if there's a W word right after, that's what trips me up.
Oh, I got it. Vunt went.
But anyway, so Wundt used extensively in his account for how compounds get made, especially at higher levels, the Kantian idea of apperception. And that was part of the debate that went on in psychology at the time. Like, what are the right principles of association? And again, I'd be interested to see how in today's, I haven't really mapped those things on yet properly, how apperception versus association plays out in the kind of in the modern terminology.
Yeah. Yeah, that's it. Because I was thinking the same thing as you were going through. I was thinking that one view sounds very Humean in a sense, and the other view sounds Kantian in a sense. So it does seem like that these early psychologists were aware of the philosophy that came before. They weren't just accidentally rediscovering, a Humean type view or an associationist view. They seemed like they were aware of that and chosen sides and thought that they had some.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I mean, not for nothing, you know, Kant and Hume, you can think of them as also talking about what science is,
Right.
right? They do
Exactly.
that deliberately. And so this was a continuous, ongoing conversation now focused on whether there could be, and Kant had denied that there could be, a separate science of psychology.
Right. Exactly.
And so that was still being worked out, whereas we take that for granted, obviously, now. But again, it's interesting to see how the influences have percolated
Yeah,
down.
exactly. So, what was Kant's reasoning about why there couldn't be an empirical psychology or a transcendental psychology? Or I don't want to get too distracted by Kant.
Yeah, and I don't know,
Okay, good.
frankly.
Okay, good.
I know a little bit about why he didn't think introspection was suitable, and this brings it back to the use of introspection, because people thought that you needed to use introspection, some sort of awareness, self-awareness, to theorize about the mind. It was that bit, putting it together with the ever developing sense of science requiring experiment and regimented observation.
Right.
How would these go together? And Kant thought you couldn't, because of the nature of he focused on attention, what I'm calling inner attention, a kind of introspective attention. He thought that just couldn't deliver
Right.
what scientific observation required.
Exactly. Okay. So there's a bunch of things that I wanted to ask you about in what we've been talking about. It's easy to get distracted by all the passing shiny objects, but when we go back to these early psychologists and then you trace the history of psychology itself, one of the things we're talking about is the way that these guys were misconstrued a little bit by their contemporary people. And how the discussion was much more nuanced than is awfully portrayed. But at the same time, is it still accurate to say that there was like intractable disagreement about these questions? The big examples being whether there can be imageless thoughts, and the other one being whether a circle, a coin at an angle looks like a circle or looks like an oval. Those are the two that I know of anyway, but I think there's others as well. But I wonder, so is that still part of the reason why this whole school of thought kind of dissipated? Or is that because you're saying that they're sophisticated and they thought about these things very carefully, but yet at the same time, this as a method did kind of go away. And you had the two competing forces. On the one hand, the Freudians, who are not using introspection really, and maybe would even say that the things that they're after can't be introspected at all because they're in the deeply repressed part of the mind. And on the other hand, in America mostly, I guess, the behaviorists who are saying, we don't need to posit any internal anythings. We'll do it all just by stimulus and response. Both of those camps, and even in a way, the cognitive revolution, are maybe well, at least as they're often portrayed, at odds with this way of thinking and thought to be sort of correctives to these early naive psychologists. Yuck, yuck. So is that part of the story inaccurate as well on your view, or what is the reason that they kind of this way of doing things cease to be dominant on your way of thinking?
All right. And I didn't answer, by the way, earlier when you asked about the reliability issue, and I guess that touches on this as well.
Yeah.
So, as you know, I think that there's always different ways to tell a story, to tell a, to spin. Now, but I think no. A There wasn't any. If you think that there was intractable self-combusting, disagreement there, and that's why it all died. I think you're sort of wrong. Oh, one is wrong. You're just
Yeah. No. What? Oh my goodness.
On several counts here. One is that it wasn't that there was one method, and it gave these conflicting results, and hence it's a bad method. And so part of what my efforts were, like, there wasn't one method.
Right.
There were many different ones. Well, there were loads of different ones, but I don't know them all. I don't know that, here it's the ones that I'm familiar with. And so there were these different ways to do it. And as I'm trying to always say, it's like the conceptions of what these people were doing from each other were so different that sometimes it's apples and oranges. There wasn't, the conflict wasn't always about this datum versus this datum. It was really much more broadly approaches to how you should do psychology to begin with, or what kind of theorizing you ought to do. And were there theories that methods and ways of doing things that we don't do anymore for good reason, and that were also lamented by the behaviorists? Absolutely. And some of the, Titchener, for example, or some of the Würzburg school using qualitative introspective reports in very extravagant ways. Absolutely. Having said all that, we're actually still carrying on many of the approaches, just, updated with modern technology, and we've never stopped doing that, using subjective report, or the subjects, tapping into the subject's own access to what's going on, in trying to do this, refine this in ever better ways. And there is really a line of continuity, where I think the behaviorists are the odd ones out, and they died.
They died. Take that, behaviorist.
but there are some purely contingent reasons for why we think that none of this work has survived at all. Partly it's because a lot of it hasn't been translated, and these so we just don't know. It's not, and I guess because there was such a different such a different vibe to the behaviorists in between, we've sort of really, you weren't to say too loudly that you were using introspection, but you did it anyway. And a lot of we've inherited so much from it that I think it's been going on most of the time, just under a different name, if you like.
And so it's also not due to the privacy issue, which is the other thing that is often thrown around, which is that in order to be a truly scientific, it has to be something that's observable publicly. And introspection as a method, I guess, although they're not clear about making this distinction that you make between the mode of access that we have and a capacity, and the method by which you try to harness that capacity, which you could do in many different ways. But still, I lost what I was going to say. Sorry. Got
Well,
distracted.
I mean, so let me just say something about privacy.
Okay. Oh, yeah, that's what I was talking about. Right.
Yeah. Um, sure, that's still a problem,
Uh-huh.
and it's still a problem, right? So again, if you are using subjective reports or introspective reports in some irresponsible, unscientific manner, then that's bad,
Yeah.
because it's not good
Yes, I think
science.
it's a very controversial statement here.
But and you still have today, methods where I think, they're not called introspective methods straightforwardly, but they are using qualitative reports gathered in various ways from subjects, and
Right.
you can worry about the scientific propriety of that.
I mean, this is something that I've always been curious about because a lot of the times you can take reports about the stimulus. It's not clear that those are introspective reports. On the other hand, as you distinguish, if you make this distinction between inner attention and inner apprehension, like for example the binoculars example that you gave, I found very interesting because I was thinking to myself, so you're, for the people not familiar with that example, you're looking through the binoculars, and so you're trying to focus the binoculars as you look at a bird or something in the distance, and your attention is focused on the bird, so you're not employing inner attention, but the claim was that you're still using a kind of introspective access to determine whether the focuses needs to be adjusted or not. But you're not doing it by attending to your experience because your attention is on the bird. Did I do
Yeah,
justice to the basic idea there?
yeah. And that is this, what I'm trying to say is that this sort of example brings out what this notion of, I'm calling it inner apprehension, but it's the um, Brentano articulated this idea of, it's translated as inner perception, which is unhelpful, I think, but because it has all sorts of connotations about what the metaphysics of the state is supposed to be. But just in terms of a type of self-awareness, you can be aware of your experiences that way, and we can exploit that. The example is meant to show that we exploit this
Right.
all the time. But where it's not that we're focusing or attending to anything in our, no, attention stays firmly on the outside.
Exactly. So in these kinds of examples, do you take them to show that all of the data that we get in psychology is introspective data in some sense, or do you get truly non-introspective data?
I'm sure you get truly non-introspective data in psychology. I mean, you just do, you know, stick people and get them to react in some way. It's not always that you're asking them to provide a button press, or, it's what you instruct them to do. But you do get behavioral data that's not introspective, or you can look at you can stick people in scanners and look what happens where the happening isn't connected to the subject carrying out any instructions that would involve them tapping first personally into something going on with them internally. So it's just that the range of what you might think of as introspective responses, or introspective reports, subjective reports, is really quite wide. And what the kind of the vehicle of report may not be directly, it doesn't have that clause in it, and it's not a explicit report by the subject, but it could be something that, where if the experiment is set up in a certain way, the experimenter can take it that this report is the result of the subject first personally accessing something.
Right. Exactly.
Now, a really interesting case here is the whole business of confidence ratings, where this kind of connection isn't straightforward, but it's super interesting, and it's something I'm thinking about a lot at the moment.
Yeah. So what's the connection to confidence ratings here?
Okay, so in So today, confidence ratings are held to be superior to often to visibility ratings, say, because visibility ratings are much more I see it or I didn't see it or it was fuzzy or something like that.
Okay.
Where the thought is you're reporting directly on, you introspect and then you report on what it's like for you or how well you saw it. Or whereas confidence rating, the thought is don't do that. They don't ask the subject to introspect. They ask the subject to just say how confident they were that they did something right, that
Right.
they chose the right thing, or they pressed the right button, or they saw. And yet, confidence ratings are taken to be reflective of or indicative of whether the subject was consciously aware of the stimulus, say, or not.
Right.
So sometimes the way it's talked about is that it's got this massive advantage over visibility rating because it's not introspective in that way. On the other hand, it is often also mentioned in the same breath as introspective reports. So it's unclear, and there's definitely obviously some. I think of it as there's a thought that there's a brute connection. People think that there's this brute connection between high confidence that in your decisions and in your correct decisions and being consciously aware of whatever the decision was about.
Yeah.
Um,
I think you're
but
right.
exactly how that goes, it's unclear. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, I think you're right to point out that it's unclear how the details go. But I think you're also right that the basic idea that these guys have, like I'm thinking of Hawkwan and Steve Fleming
Mm-hmm.
and Lau and those guys. I think that the basic idea that they have is that when you have a conscious experience, that it kind of generates confidence automatically or something like that, so that one is a good, reliable indicator of the other.
Right.
That's supposed to
Right.
be
And
the idea, yeah.
that seems totally plausible, right?
Yeah.
um, I
Yeah,
mean,
exactly. It doesn't seem too
except
bad.
except that. So, from my point of view, one is just I'm just then interested in what exactly that relationship is, such that you think it avoids all the problems that your classic introspective move involving visibility ratings has those problems, but confidence ratings doesn't. And I'm not saying that then they're wrong about this. I'm just interested in the details of this story. And the other thing is that while I think this makes total sense and it's very, very plausible in the clear cases, of course, what the interest here is in the threshold cases. And there, I would really like to see more details
Right, because
about
how you
exactly how.
interpret those is really going to depend on the background assumptions you make, because especially at the threshold levels.
Yeah, and that's where the experiments really go to, right?
Yeah,
I
the
mean,
interesting test
yeah.
cases. I mean, I've always been kind of sympathetic to the idea that we shouldn't be too reliant on confidence judgments because we have confidence judgments in blindsight patients, like from GY, and they can become quite confident taking their. I mean, there's it takes them time, but over time they come to rely on the judgment that they're making, even though they claim not to be able to experience anything that distinguishes the stimuli that they're making these pronouncements about. But nonetheless, they can say, well, I'm fairly confident that I'm right, that was a plus or X or whatever. So I'm not sure. I don't think that means that we should rule out confidence judgments altogether. I just think that it does kind of make us wonder about what it is exactly we're tapping into, whether it's something cognitive or directly experiential. And these kinds of
Yeah.
questions aren't answered by. So yeah, I guess I'm kind of agreeing with what you're saying more than anything else. But I wonder, what is your feeling about the blindsight case in confidence? How would you?
In confidence. Um, I'm a great fan of Ian Phillips' paper on this, so I guess I've imbibed a lot of his take
Okay.
on the debate. So I don't find it. So I find it certainly has removed this as any sort of cornerstone in, fixing, being a test case for the goodness of a theory, just because there's these different interpretations available.
Right, exactly.
And I think that, Ian's paper is very persuasive.
Yeah, I agree. Been wanting to talk to Ian about this stuff on here for a long time, so we'll keep working on that.
Yeah.
Okay, so I did have one question from the audience from Anatol Wagner, who was asking about reliability. We were talking about this a while ago, but I wanted to make sure to get to it. But he asks, do you have an answer to Chomsky's critique that one can introspect as much the inner workings of the mind as one can introspect the inner workings of digestion? So I think he's alluding to the idea that on Chomsky's view, we can't really introspect much of what's happening in the mind. So whatever we do have access to is going to be very limited, and not really give us a kind of handle on the true nature of the inner workings, which is something that I was alluding to earlier about the nature of the cognitive sciences not using introspection. Like for example, I don't think the universal grammar and those kinds of things is unless you're going to say judgments about grammaticality involve the introspective judgments, which maybe anyway. So yeah, what are your thoughts about this question, especially with respect to the early psychologists, but also just generally with respect to the science?
Sure. I mean, first I should clarify. I think you can actually introspectively tell something about your digestion. It's not,
Whether it's going well or bad.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm just saying it's not chopped liver, but yeah, sure. In a way, that's partly my point has always been. It's like don't expect introspection to tell you everything.
Okay.
But you need to, and the early introspectionists, especially people like Wundt, were incredibly good at limiting, at being clear about what the limits are of what introspection can do for you. Having said that, investigating the mind entirely without it seems also problematic.
Right.
And by that I just mean you've got to get some observational data that at least clarifies what the phenomenon is that you're theorizing about from the first person perspective. There is some constraining force coming from that side. Now, then it's a good question, how much are you going to expect from this sort of observational data? And we were just talking about that earlier, that there were these different pictures about what observation is supposed to deliver.
Right.
And you can be more or less extravagant about that, and you should get it right. But I think that even Chomsky is going to rely, and I don't know anything about that area, but aren't there judgments of grammaticality, for example, that are at work there? And what are those? They are kind of, at least in some sense,
broad
connected
sense
to first person tapping into what seems right.
So the idea is not that introspection is the only method that psychology can use, but rather that it's a reputable method that can be used in the right circumstances. That's the more important message.
Well, yes, but I mean, I'm almost surprised that needs pointing out, right? I mean,
well, I mean, one reason
it's like one tool in the bag of the scientist is of the psychologist is that, and it's an important tool and it needs to be used correctly.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so I think there's, depending on who you talk to, if you talk to people that do like animal work, then they don't have access to this sort of data. You might think, depending on how you define these things, if you think that a mouse pressing a button for, whether a certain stimulus appears or not counts as using introspection. I don't know. So I guess that could be debated. But if you don't take that view, then a large part of psychology, which is done in animal research, just is sort of excluded from these kinds of methodological considerations, because obviously we're considering just from the human case exclusively. So that would be, that would be much too narrow if you just said this was the only way that psychology could proceed, or that the only way to understand the mind could
But
proceed
as
this
you
way.
said,
But yeah, go
sorry.
ahead.
But as you said, I mean, it depends how you configure, how you think about first person access and introspection now. Um, and that is an interesting question, obviously. Partly the problem is that in discussion, often like any sort of self-reflection is going to count. And sometimes people have something very, very narrow in mind,
Right.
and it's never clear. But here we were talking about confidence ratings. Are they kinds of, kinds of introspection? If you don't like that word, just say first person access.
Right.
Well, in that case, lots of animal studies now try to elicit confidence ratings from animals, and that's a super interesting question.
Exactly. And that's why I think the blind question is so relevant in this case, because it's the closest we have to like the case of the non-human animals where they can't report. And if they could still have confidence, then one wonders like how we should interpret the fact that these non-human animals have confidence. So I mean, I'm not saying we should interpret one way or the other. I just think that the methodological question about this exact question about whether confidence judgments are count as introspective or not is very thorny. And in that sense, I wonder, do you think we've have we made progress on this? I mean, we as a field of persons interested in
Yeah.
the science of the mind, have we made progress on this issue at the discipline-wide level as opposed to the individual-like level?
I think so. I mean, um, so I think Matthias Michel, for example, is doing really, really interesting work on just this issue as well.
Yeah.
And the whole area of metacognition is, in a sense, starting to unravel a bunch of these notions in a way that one can, it's really exciting what's happening there. And
Yeah.
one can just sort of start to see how we find different ways of configuring and talking about first person access. That's much more controlled and tethered to specific roles and experimental paradigms. That's quite helpful. Always in this is, I'm not focused on, it's good not to focus on the word itself. It doesn't, nobody owns the word introspection. So it sometimes when it gets a bit sidetracked by, it's like, but is it introspection? It's like, just sort of, what is it? And does it map onto something that we think we're talking about when we're using introspection in more everyday contexts?
Right.
And perhaps also how it was used.
I
Say
mean,
that's why it's used in the early psychology literature, where it did have there were specific meanings, so we can track these different roles and ideas and see what happens to them now.
so I was going to ask something else, but since you just said this, I wondered. So if we sort of jumped from the like first half of the book to the second half of the book in a non-linear way, all of a sudden because of what you just said. So in the second part of the book where you're sort of examining, so not this question from what's the right method for psychology more generally speaking, but sort of what is introspection in these three different ways of accessing from the first person that you distinguished. And part of the story that you want to argue for is there's an eliminativism in there somewhere about some of these concepts. So
Me?
yeah, from your point of view,
Oh,
is that not right, or am I misreading the? Yeah, I guess that's my question. Is from your point of view, because the way I was interpreting it was that you wanted to say we're gonna be kind of limitivist about one notion of these kinds of things, and
I
not
see.
about the other one. And then you want to distinguish the kind of
I see.
scientific concept from the folk concept or something like
Yeah.
that. So yeah, could you? I was going to connect that to what you were just saying, but I wonder, could you tell us a little bit about what's going on in that part of your work?
Yeah. Yeah. So good. So one useful thing for me, having distinguished the introspective method use of introspection from introspective access, which is a kind of mental capacity, is that we can really separate issues of reliability and again, still haven't spoken to reliability, but one day,
We're gonna get there, hopefully.
yeah,
Yes,
right.
that's a good
But
point.
and one interest is like in when we look at introspection as a mental capacity. So one question is like, is it reliable? Can we come to know anything? Do we have introspective knowledge, this kind of self-knowledge via introspection, where that may involve, in my books, introspection involves a kind of detection. It's a self-detection. How to spell that out, I'm not quite clear yet. It's something I'm working on, but
Okay.
okay. And then I want to say that there are these different types of introspection, introspective access, retrospection, inner attention, and inner apprehension. I'm just labeling these now. And it's for me then a good question how maybe there's more types than that, but let's start with these that I can find in the literature and where I make a case that we can find at least the seeds for that in how we're putting to use self-attributions and attributions to other, listening to self-attributions from others of introspective states. And hang on, I can talk about that more in a second, but just to go straightforwardly to what you were saying, my view is that we can think of introspection as a mental capacity, introspective access, as a common sense category. It's a common sense kind. It plays a role in everyday business and in particular, it plays a role in how we self-manage and how we plan using, kind of needing to self-manage and plan. And so from that point of view, introspective access is sort of tied to how we think of ourselves as agents and what we can and can't do. And this kind of planning role that introspection in common sense has, we can see that there's patterns that sort of at least give us the seeds to start theorizing about these three different types of introspective access, again, in the context of common sense explanatory role. However, I want to say that for these minimally three or whatever, three different types of introspective access that we can find in common sense, at least the seeds of it, we can see how they connect, how we could scientifically theorize them. And they can be up for, in each case, for scientific investigation and revision and correction and so forth. Right. And that's because we can look at memory, attention, and I'm not quite sure yet what to do with the inner apprehension, but I think that there's definitely something that we could also see whether there's a certain scientific approach to these. Not though for the overall category. So in terms of what do all of these three, why would we group all three together as an introspective kind? I think so far we've got not much to show for in the sciences to motivate that. But there is a substance in common sense explanation, in common sense practice, to think of this as one kind. So there's a kind of common sense kind, but my aim is always to answer the Sellers challenge, the manifest image and the scientific image of the mind. And I would like to have it the case that whatever we talk about as real, a real mental phenomenon, we find in common sense that it's sort of real only if we can naturalize it in some sense.
Right. Okay.
At least there's sort of connection points where we can see, okay, there's a science of that.
So just to be clarify from my own point of view, the idea is that there's inner attention, inner apprehension, and retrospection, and those are real psychological capacities, psychological processes that you could investigate and do a science of. But there's no instance of a kind of which you would want to say that all three of those things are instances of that kind, even though we intuitively think that they are all introspective in some sense, so they must have something in common. They really don't. That's the view.
That's the view. Although I've recently having looked more at the what's happening in the science of metacognition, perhaps the best way to put it is that right now there's no reason that we don't yet have anything identified, I think, that would like be the mechanism or something like that. That would this is what all these different types of self, first person access have in common. It's that mechanism. There are versions of that. I think that perhaps the best way to put it is that is still open, and it depends how things are going in that science. But it's an interest of mine to see how introspection, as I conceive of it from the agency-related common sense perspective, how that fits anyway with the scientific construct of metacognition. So I developed this picture about introspection in the context of self-management being sort of helpful to plan and explain how we have self-management abilities and how we can self-manage. That really does fit super nicely with the idea of metacognition as a kind of evaluation and control of that we have to self-govern in various ways.
Well, can you just, before you go any further, sorry to interrupt, but can you give us an example of like this common sense control guidance thing that you have in mind?
Yeah, so one you mentioned earlier, I have the being able to focus your binoculars. That would be one that deploys something like the, why, I'm asking you, how can you do that? Well, you're able to tap into, so why am I attributing to you this ability that you can do that is because I think you have access to your visual experience in that way that you can successfully do that. And similarly, why is it that, if you're really under stress and you're busy doing something, you really need to get something done, and you kind of, but you're feeling panicky, and you can sort of try and get a hold of yourself, your racing thoughts, and make sure you're tracking everything carefully. All of these are kinds of abilities of self-management which require, I say, one explanation is that you have access to your thoughts racing, and you are able to manage your conscious situation. It's these kinds of abilities that I have in mind.
Because I do wonder like what you're going to say, and this is something I was going to bring up a long time ago, but so since we're circling back around to it, I wonder what you would say to the skeptic about introspection, or whether you can accommodate the skeptic in the kind of view that you're developing. Someone who says, we don't ever have this kind of first-person access. We, have access to stuff in the external world and then make a judgment about what's happening. What must be, there must be some internal state, which is me seeing the tomato or whatever, but it's not that any kind of first-person access that I have to the state. It's this indirect, displaced perception through the perception of the external object. And so this kind of person is going to be someone who might deny the inner apprehension, even as like a feature of the phenomenology, even that they have. So So, like, on your view, does the science of psychology or consciousness have to incorporate that kind of view as well?
Uh, so let me distinguish two things first that might be under attack from the kind of corner you mentioned. One is the idea that introspective access is a type of self-detection. And then what you were just telling me was a kind of, Rileyan, Alex Byrne type view, which says it's nothing like that. It's, inference, you're just looking, or, Gareth Evans, you're looking out.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
you're coming to know about your mental state. Well, there's a sense in which, okay, it's a different dispute to have, but that's not undermining the idea that we can acquire that kind of self-knowledge and that plays a certain role, right? It's just that the dispute is about how do you acquire it?
Right.
Is it self-detection or something like having these inference rules, or a kind of Gareth Evans type view? So that, but you might have said, look, we don't need to attribute any such self-knowledge at all, no matter how you get it. We're not doing that. We're just, there's first order states all the way through.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
I have nothing to say to somebody like that.
Okay.
I mean, okay, I can't say something, but it's like I don't feel that I don't,
Yeah.
at some point it's like
Too fundamental
okay,
of a
maybe
disagreement.
I need to, if I want to have a dispute with this person, I need to do other things. I can't do that from within, where I'm trying to explain certain other things about once you think that there are these introspective states, call them introspective states or higher order states, and I'm telling you what they do and why we think that they are good sometimes, why they amount to knowledge, and all sorts of other things. But yeah.
Okay. Yes, I mean, sometimes it's just like the starting points are too different and you have to engage on a different area.
But I should say, I should clarify, it's not that I think this is a stupid thing to say, or it's just that I can't be doing it all from the same position. I can't be carrying out all these
Exactly.
defenses and disputes. I need to
Yeah.
change position to do this other thing.
Right, exactly. This is
Yeah.
one dispute that you're engaged in.
Yeah.
Exactly. Okay. So, when it comes to this idea of self detection, so one thing that I thought was interesting, and I think I saw you cite it in the book, was the idea that from Gualtiero Piccinini, of the idea of people as being kind of measuring instruments in a sense, and
Yeah.
that you could treat introspective judgments as a kind of self measurement, or and treating them as measurement instruments. Therefore, they could be calibrated in sort of the way we think of perfectly objective manners. So I got the sense from what I read, though, that you were setting that kind of approach aside. And I wonder if that was just because of convenience, or if you think there's some flaw with that approach or something.
Um,
And it's just out of curiosity.
Neither
Neither.
convenience
Okay.
nor flaw. So and
Okay.
maybe a little convenience, actually.
Okay.
But that's because I did that in the following context. There is this requirement that this comes to reliability, right?
Exactly.
We're talking about reliability, in particular of method, right? That's really, we have to be clear about that, of method. And this played a big role in the behaviorist rejection also of the introspectionists. There's this thought that for a method to be reliable, it's got to be public.
Right.
Right. And Gualtiero answers that and says it can be public because we should just treat the reports as public items.
Right.
And really, we're using people like measurements. And so they just deliver this publicly available stuff, the reports. So that's one way to answer that challenge that, look, for a method to be scientific, it needs to be reliable. For it to be reliable, it needs to be public. That's like Hempel and people like that.
Mm-hmm.
And Gualtieri says, oh, and then people say, but introspection is private and hence no reliability because no publicity. Okay. And Gualtieri says, no, actually the data is perfectly public.
Right.
I don't do that. Goldman sort of formulates a different way to answer the challenge, and I'm much more in line with Goldman on that. So Goldman says, well, wait, it's not that the method has to be public for it to be reliable. It's just that it has to be reliable. It has to be such that we don't have any reason to think that it's unreliable.
Right.
It has to do some sort of a good job. In some, we have to specify, antecedently why this seems to be a good way to get at the data. And so long as we don't really have any good reason to think that it's unreliable,
Mm-hmm.
we can go ahead and use it. And that seems right to me, right? So the privacy alone isn't yet any sign of unreliability. Okay. What it is that if you have reason to think it's unreliable, then you have a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why I didn't talk about Gualtiero's view, because I was going down this other route. And so my way of doing things is trying to say that there's ways to build on Goldman's approach.
The idea that it can be private but still reliable.
Well, yeah, that we can. But so my whole approach then is to say what we need to do is figure out different ways in which it might be unreliable.
Right.
And we have sort of some ideas about what those are by looking at things like demand characteristics, certain types of interferences that can happen in different experimental contexts. We know we can find out more about the different types. The more we know about the types of first-person access that are being deployed scientifically, the more we can figure out how to support and constrain and set up the experimental design so that we avoid certain pitfalls. All of these things, the blueprint, I always say, has been delivered already in the early experimentalists. That's partly what they tried to do. But obviously now we have even better ways to do that, it seems, on all fronts. But the whole point there I'm making there really in the book is to say we need to reduce the potential for unreliability.
Right.
And once we've satisfied ourselves to do that, we can really go ahead and use it, until we see that there's a problem.
So, sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, it's just that won't ever answer your person who says, well, there is no introspection to begin with. But then we can't be talking to them at this point, right?
Okay, exactly. No, we'll talk to them later. Because to me, the idea of calibration is tied up here, because part of what we want when we're talking about a method being public is that it can be calibrated. You could tell when it goes wrong. You can adjust. You can adjust things if you see that it's going off track, and if someone else notices it, they can adjust it. But in the case of introspection, of it, the claim usually goes it's private. Hence, there's no calibration. So this is sometimes put in terms of incorrigibility. That you can't be corrected. There's no one who's outside who could say is in a better position to say, no, you're incorrect about that. And that may be completely independent of being infallible. Whether it's infallible or not, it still has this property of being incorrigible. And that is sometimes taken to be the defining problematic feature. But you have some interesting things to say about the idea of calibration. So I wonder, so can you tell us, what would you say about that?
Yeah, so, I mean, in a sense, I've given you the outline a bit already, that I think that calibration Well, the first point is that given the distinction I have between method and access, so introspective method and introspective access, calibration really, we need to understand that we may mean by calibration just figuring out what is the range of reliability of this mental capacity, of this form of access,
Right.
cognitive access. Just like we might ask about visual perception, or so what's the range of, we don't have eagle eyes, we have, there's a certain range, and we want to figure out what is the acuity, equivalent and all of that. So within which range can we expect knowledge by access, deploying this mental capacity?
So,
And
just before you go on from that, would you say that like things like meta D prime, which has come out of work of Hakwan and Steve, are trying to answer that kind of question?
that's interesting. Yes, yes. Um, yes, the kind of metacognitive efficiency, for example,
Right.
and pulling apart these notions. And yes, this is definitely one aspect of those sorts of efforts.
Okay.
Um, how applicable these things are to specific ideas about specific forms of introspective access is a super interesting question.
So, but what they
And
haven't done is really distinguish like what mode of introspective access do they think that this is getting at when they. I mean, if
so
you're.
I'm not, yeah, and I don't even want to say anything about that because I think that
It's
well,
wise of you, right?
just because there's a sense in which they're doing something quite different, and they're not interested in that sort of question at that point. But yeah, I actually let's just change topic because
Okay.
but it's such a good question, right? It's just I have no good way to. I'm still sort of trying to figure out how to approach that.
Okay.
Um,
So
and
let
specifically,
I was going to say let you go ahead and continue with what you were saying on the other side of that. Then that if you have the introspective access, you have the questions that fall out that way. But then on the other side, the method side.
yeah, but you are so right to say that these are the kinds of things where I think we can bring these to bear, hopefully fruitfully, um, in application of method, and understanding what it is that we're even expecting of these methods.
Well, and I
Where
will just say on a random ramble that this is something that I think that I learned from Hakwan specifically, but Steve as well. But just the idea that paying attention to like the history is important in these because a lot of the stuff that we're confused about, they were confused about too, but had worked out some answers. So paying attention to that, but it's missing from the average education of an experimentalist or researcher. They
yeah,
don't really get exposed in any sort of detail to the history of the discipline. But they got a lot of other stuff to cover. You can't cover everything.
I
I
was going
gotta
to
get
say
it,
that
but
the trouble is that there's just too much these days, right?
yeah, it's true.
um, yeah, but I forgot now where you were.
Oh, sorry about that. I know.
Oh, the calibration.
Yeah,
So one
exactly.
thing is just calibrating, the range of reliability for a given mental capacity, different type of introspective access. And sort of thinking about the good circumstances in which to deploy it, in which you can think well or introspect well or perceive well, but have some light on and things like that, in perception. And this is really drawing on Goldman's work a lot. There's operational conditions and there are the kind of the contents we can expect to come to know, what we can know. So when it comes to calibrating methods, um, that needs to flow in to figure out how best for any specific method, not in general, because it's always case specific, right? It depends what you're looking at, what your kind of theoretical aims are, and now which type of introspective access you're going to deploy, how you're going to set up the experiment. And then there's a question about reliability here and calibration that concerns the whole shebang.
Right.
And there, I think we can do a lot. Not to think that there's a one, oh, introspection is unreliable, hence nothing is good here. But we have a lot in the method, on the method side, we have a lot of leeway to maneuver. I mean, like I'm sure they're all familiar with in the labs, that you tinker this way and you try to avoid these sorts of pitfalls here and adjust here, and so you can compensate some problems that might have turned up when you looked at different forms of where there's weaknesses, where there's potential for interference or for being, misleading in various ways. And you can then set your experiment, you calibrate based on the whole picture. So that's how I think about calibration. And that's why I think we can do so much to reduce worries about unreliability. And then if we can do a really good plausible job, then I think we can go right ahead and use it, even though you have a component in there that is in some sense private, right? Where you just have to solve, you have to trust the subject.
To some degree or other, exactly. So how does this like framework that you have developed here, how would we apply it to a well-known dispute? Like, for example, and you mentioned this in your book, but I want to draw it out a little bit here. The dispute over unconscious perception. So, take subliminal priming or any sort of a thing of this nature, and you have one side, and you divide them into the optimists and the, what do you say, the religiously optimistic and the pessimist, the naive pessimist, or what, I forget the two camps exactly. But anyway, so there's, the one group that we're all doomed, and the other group that everything's fine. And so you're trying to chart a way in between there. But in this case, your middle way path, if you have one camp who says, look, in the case of this subliminal perception, what you have is information processing, but it's not perception. And in the other case, you have someone saying, oh, no, it's definitely a perception. It's just not a conscious perception. And so these are cases where they may be using, button pressing to determine whether or not the subject saw detected the stimulus, and then verbal reports for checking if the subject was conscious. And then there's a dispute about how we interpret all this, having some partially to do with the problem of the criterion, but also just generally, when do we take the subjects to be at face valuable and so forth and so on. So in this particular type of case, does your way of approaching things, I'm not having trouble phrasing what I'm trying to say, but what I'm trying to really ask is, what would be the verdict of your way of thinking things given the current evidence we have about this debate?
You mean, do I solve the problem? No, I don't.
Yeah, not that you solve the problem, but is there something that your way of doing things would let us, how would it interpret what we do?
What, if anything, does that contribute? Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't mean to be asking exactly that way, but I guess that's what it amounts to.
Good. So just to say it, so when I parcel people up into pessimists, really full-on wholesome, full-on pessimists, faith-based optimists.
That's it. The faith.
That'll be all right. What can you do? And then in the middle, that's the important bit. There are people who feel like, we can't do with, we can't do without. They're the kind of, they sit there and think, we still want to do this. We still want to do this. We're just not quite sure. And so I think neither of these. So what I try to offer is a more firmer way to be in the middle. It's not as if nobody else is in the middle.
I see.
It's just,
that's
I want
important.
to try and give a bit more of a principled way to say you can be in the middle and see where the limitations are. Not because you say, well, the pessimists are shouting very loudly and we should listen to them a little bit. But no, but they're really more concrete reasons that you can spell out for why there are worries about the method. So what I'm hoping is I'm giving as I said, a more detailed and specific middle ground that allows you to draw in principled ways a line where you're more likely to worry about the reliability of your results and where you don't have to have as great a worry.
I
So
see.
taking that now to the dispute, one thing I do think is that at least, again, things change all the time. But when you look at the early introspectionists, I mean, many of them were the good ones, I think, were pretty clear that you shouldn't use introspective methods in borderline cases too much. That's where you are outrunning a lot of your method is going to be dodgy in some significant way. Not that where if you're not then clear that there's dodginess there, given that you're trying to apply introspection, again, helpful to look at the mental capacity. If the limits, if the range of reliability for the mental capacities really starts to give out at the borderline case, then deploying it in a method is going to be problematic.
Yeah.
Not because there's a problem with introspection, it's just because you're using it. It's like using perception to do something. Perception isn't really, to get people to give you visual reports on what's happening very, very, very far down, where we shouldn't be expecting to have clear
Right.
vision.
It's not that vision is suspect. It's just that you're asking them to do something it's not really good at doing.
That's right. And that's sort of how I think about one thing that I offer in these disputes is just being more clear about how severe a criticism it might be to say that this is a bad application of the method.
Okay.
Yeah, but I deliberately don't want to say that you shouldn't use it in these cases, because things are developing further and further, and but suppose we're thinking now that really right now the methods are a bit dodgy. I'm not saying that they are, but let's say we say that, then perhaps one takeaway isn't, we shouldn't do the science of consciousness at all, but we can just as well use purely objective methods such as they are at this point, and there isn't that much, we can use them all in sort of equal footing or something like that, and just be clear about what the limitations are.
And so, I thought that you were going to maybe defend in Philip's view here, which is that maybe there isn't the unconscious perception, but it sounds like you're kind of staying neutral on the question.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Neutral is my middle name.
Oh, I did not know that. Okay.
No, it's just because partly no, I don't want to defend that either, because, as I said, I'm a great fan of the paper, partly because for me it really puts both of these options on the table in a way that I don't want to then say I'm going for the other one. And Ian has arguments for that and all of that, but for me it's much more the methodological point that sits at the center there.
Okay, I see. Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of the approach, and much like you, I found myself kind of sucked into talking about introspection. For me, for the kind of the opposite reason. For you, you said you were interested in perception first, and then got sidetracked talking about introspection. Whereas for me, it was consciousness generally speaking, and then questions about introspection arising for the similar reason. So it's nice to see people paying attention to it and trying to be serious about it, and to take it at its, for what it is, a capacity that we have. It's something that may be useful for doing the sciences. But yeah, I think it's welcome to have this kind of attention to it.
But it is useful for doing science.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? I mean, and I see also although I have, it's unfortunate for this podcast, but I don't really have very good views about what consciousness is.
Hey, that's
But
fine.
but I do think you're right that so for me, definitely the way would be to approach it via introspection and the idea of self-awareness.
Yeah.
Um, it is also interesting to see because people talk about Bewusstsein or consciousness in obviously in the 19th century and there is a big debate about whether the mind is, for one difference in the theoretical approaches is between Germany and say Britain, for example, is that there's different ideas about how the mind does or does not outrun consciousness.
Right.
So Leibniz seems to have had the view that there is unconscious parts of the mind, and that set the frame, the background for a lot of the discussions in Germany where introspection wasn't, certainly introspection wasn't expected even to be the only introspective method, the only way to get at the mind.
Right.
But, it was just one among others. Whereas in Britain, from the empiricists, you had much more of a coextension between what's conscious and what's minded. And so there, and everything, knowledge comes only via observation. And there, the expectation of what introspective observation is supposed to deliver is much higher from the get-go.
Right.
Um, but it is an interesting question what they all had in mind by consciousness to begin with and unconsciousness, whereas because Ned Block hadn't written his paper yet.
Exactly. Yeah, no, it's not clear, but yeah, no, that's an interesting way of framing things too between Britain and the German traditions. And the Leibniz is the petite perceptions, or is that what I forget the exact the
I don't know that much about it. Again, I'm working my way backwards, but
yeah, exactly. Well, there's
I'm
a
sort
lot
of
to work your way through.
1840 at this point.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, a little ways further to go back. But yeah, you'll find, I think, once you get into the, talking about Barclay and those guys, that a lot of these same issues
Yeah.
arise. Okay. So I do notice we're getting on in time, and I can't keep you from talking about this forever. But I do want to ask, sort of at the end, whether there was anything that you were wanting to have come up that hasn't come up yet. And the answer can be no, but I always like to check and just see if there's something that you wanted to talk about that we hadn't got to.
That's a lot of pressure, that
Oh,
question.
sorry. It's not supposed to be a pressure question, just an opportunity to bring up something if you want to.
I guess, I mean, one interesting for me connection in all of this is the notion of abilities. Um, it shows up for me, it showed up in self-management at first, because I think that that's just so much of our common sense picture is connected to our conception of ourselves as agents. And similarly, there's a kind of very crude way of thinking about what happens in psychology or in the science of the mind, where it's a lot about capacity. What you're trying to do is you look at behavior and figure out the capacities, and a lot of it focuses on capacities.
Right.
And so the whole notion of abilities is really interesting and in its own right. And so I'm thinking that I would like to be able to have I'm going in a direction where I'm looking more at agency and abilities as a good place to try and fit the manifest with a scientific image. That is a background aim for me always, to not lose the common sense mind, the phenomenon as we encounter it, entirely, and to try and connect what's happening in the science of the mind with something that I can recognize. Not that I want to read off anything from the common sense picture into the science, but I do want there to be connection points. And especially with things like consciousness and all these interesting notions. And I'm very hopeful that we can do that so long as we keep talking to psychologists
Yeah,
and psychologists
exactly.
keep talking to us. But for me right now, the focus is on these kind of the ideas of abilities and how we can know them. And that's
And how does agency play a role there? Like what? Are you going to try to limit the notion of agency to the personal level, or are you going to extend it to the like subpersonal levels of the mind?
well, I don't, for a start, I don't think I need to extend anything. I mean, we talk about chemical agents, and
Right.
so it's I think the notion is already ready made to span different levels of description and understanding of the mind. And but what's nice is that it's also the locus of being norm governed and being all sorts of different types of agents.
Right.
And yeah, I just have this sense that if I go to if I look at abilities and agency as, just something that has abilities or capacities, I can perhaps find my way into um, a plausible way to graft the two pictures or the several pictures onto each other.
Right, but so you wouldn't be, or would you be going all the way towards arguing for the idea that science needs to include these kinds of teleological notions? Because
Oh, I see.
some people might think we spend a lot of time trying to purge those notions, like especially from chemistry and related issues.
Yeah, no, see, this is why perhaps I shouldn't have mentioned the whole thing
Okay,
because but
it's a
I
can of
don't want to
worms.
I don't want to sound reductive about anything.
Okay,
What I just find that it sounds to me like um, there is a abilities are such that I can make sense of them fully as something had by a biological organism or some sort of system,
okay,
but also I can make sense of them as being imbued with all sorts of values and governed by norms and things like that, where it's not as if I can now reduce one to the other, but I can see where they might apply.
okay. So
And
what do you think of like the new mechanism of people like Carl Craver and those of that school of? Is that too
okay,
reductive?
we may have to cut this out of the recording afterwards. To tell you the truth,
Okay.
um, I'm still having trouble understanding the idea of a mechanism
Okay.
in that. And I am trying because it does seem important to me to figure it out. And it is important to, I mean, I'm so glad you mentioned that because, part of my view of this kind of, I'm calling it composite pluralism, where I think that there are the scientific kinds that are more the specific types of introspective access. We can find, we can think of there being scientific kinds that answer or at least subject to revision, and the ordinary kind. But I want to say that we don't have to think of the ordinary kind as not real just because there's no local mechanism that it picks out at the scientific level. But we can think of in the kind of explanatory patterns that I point to. It's much more a Dennettian view of,
Right.
um,
The real
there's
patterns
enough
approach.
pattern there. There's enough pattern there that grounds the common sense kind for it to give it sufficient reality, if you like. So we don't have to be, to say earlier, because you're calling me an
I
eliminativist.
know. Now I see why you
I
want to
am
resist
not.
that. But I do think of
I am
Dennett's
not.
view as an anti-realist view about the propositional attitudes.
Okay, but still, I think you can think of, who knows exactly what,
Yeah, exactly.
but some version of that where what you do not require is there be a local mechanism
Right.
that underwrites the common sense kind introspective
And
access.
that's why you look for these causal regularities as the thing that underwrites them.
That's right.
Right.
So they're real enough. Um, they're kind of the whole environment or the whole system has features these, and local mechanisms are playing a role in the subkinds, but they don't ground in that sense. So that would be one metaphysically pleasing picture
Right.
of that. Yeah.
Right. So that and then, but that might put your view at odds with that kind of mechanistic view because there's no sense in which the chain of mechanisms explains the higher level features.
Yeah, see, this is where I first have to understand exactly what their view, what this view really encompasses and
I
doesn't
see.
encompass, and I how how really local the mechanism is that what constrains being a mechanism.
Right. No, I see what you mean. Yeah, exactly. Because if it can be a more encompass this more global feature of that the higher level, then maybe this is a mechanistic account of that higher level feature.
And then I don't care, I mean, again, it's about I don't care what you call it.
Right.
It's just the idea is that I've managed to not have to find anything that sort of directly shows up.
Right.
Um, but it can be built from pattern,
Right.
patterns that emerge, causal patterns that emerge, and that they do is, I think, clear in our everyday agency. That's the thing. These self-manage, we do self-manage, and we can. There's empirical reason to think that these patterns are real, and
Right.
that's what. Um,
But if you were if you were laying out the building blocks of the mind, they wouldn't be included in there. They
the
would
they being.
these abilities that you're talking about, the capacities.
Oh, I see. No, no, the capacity. Ah, okay.
But what would be included, it sounds like, are
Well,
things
no,
like
there
the
would
inner.
be. So there would be capacities there. It's just that there wouldn't be a single capacity. So if we're talking now about the overarching, common sense concept, introspective access. That is the kind of the group
Right.
of the different. So there would be locatable ones, let's say, but there's probably not. There's going to be more detailed, like attention. There's no one thing like attention, but there's going to be locatable mechanisms we can, the capacities we can um,
Right.
that are posited, but there's no single one of the same order, as it were, as those. But yet, because of the patterns, we get to say it's real in that sense. Now, when I say it like that, it sounds a bit breezy. Yeah,
No, you do a lot to flesh it out. But now I'm seeing more why you want to distinguish it from someone like Jesse Prince's view, who wants to say there's just like it's a similar kind of pluralism, but in a very different kind of way.
100%.
Yeah.
So Jesse Prince, as far as I understand, he has a pluralism where he just says, look, there are all these different types of processes that we can locate and that we might want to call introspection of sorts. Nothing in common. So I take that to be an argument for eliminativism, and he says as much.
Right.
He thinks that, so the analogy he gives is that introspection as a category is just like the category of natural disasters.
Yeah.
There is floods, there is volcanoes, there is droughts. There's no science in common of natural disasters. It's just a practical category because it's sort of insurance purposes or something like that needs to group these together.
Right.
But that's it. And I want to say that that's eliminativist in a way we shouldn't be, precisely because introspection does play this really important everyday role,
Right.
explanatory role in agency. So, and I want there to be a certain sense of reality to us being able to introspect. But yet I see what he's saying about that, maybe not about all the different types that he mentions, but that there is no single underlying.
Right. Well, that's the sense I was saying it was eliminativist. I was saying that from you're eliminating that from the scientific concept as a scientific concept, but wanting
Yeah.
to keep it as a common sense concept, or at least that's the way I was interpreting it.
Right. And so I would, in the, at least the way, again, it's sort of maybe potatoes, or whatever you Americans say.
That's what we say.
But, but I was thinking of myself as not eliminativist because I give substance to the common sense category.
Uh-huh.
But I deny that we have to give that substance by showing that it can be reducible, or that we can find a scientific an appropriate scientific kind in terms of a single mechanism for
Yeah,
it.
and I understand how they could hold that as a kind of non-eliminativism, but I'm still kind of wondering, like, if you had to write the science of psychology textbook, would those things be included or not? Is kind of the question that I'm.
Oh, that's such a nice question. Um, First of all, I would take a long time to write this book.
Yeah. Well, James set the precedent, so you could take forever.
but but so in a psychology, good. So maybe what I would do, and this goes back to the agency thing.
Mm-hmm.
For me, it's always important to not lose sight of the phenomenon. Like, what are we we often in philosophy, I think it can happen. We start to build our theories, and then we're off. We're just
Exactly. We're
moving the
not
pieces
coming
around,
back.
and
Yeah.
you know, and so part of what I try to do in the book is I always bring it back to, like, what is it that we're actually talking about, and how much is there before we start theorizing about it? What is this notion? How can we help ourselves to this notion to begin with, to think that it's something that warrants um, theorizing and thinking of as part of the mind? And so that's why common sense, finding it in common sense is an important step for me to even get off the ground
Right.
with thinking about what is it that we want to talk about here. And I definitely would want to make that clear in the psychology, and to think that it's a genuinely interesting question to think about how what we specify at the scientific level bears on the creature we recognize. Given that we say we behave in these ways, and science tells us that we do metacognitively, we do this and that, but we also self-manage in various ways. We also seem to be reason guided in various ways. And I'm not saying you should reduce, again, there's no simple story here, but whatever it is that you're saying happens in the mind, I want it to be compatible at least with something that I recognize. And vice versa, right?
And vice versa. Yeah,
Oh,
exactly.
yeah.
It's got to go both ways. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I find this question very interesting because at some level, we all know there's going to be some level of revision
Yeah.
as we start to do science, from the common sense to the scientific understanding. But the question is, like, how much do we want to revise, and how much are we? And that's what a lot of this debate, going all the way back to the Churchlands and
Yeah.
eliminativists, has really centered on, is like, what ultimately does the science want to explain? And do we
Yeah.
take this as a good starting point, or should we get rid of it all and start
Yeah.
over? And that seems very drastic to me. It always has been.
I mean, at the same time, I've gotten into thinking about different just explanatory frameworks, and that even the configuring of the initial phenomenon is to some extent already a certain choice. Certain
Right.
choices have been made, and that's just interesting as well to think about in this would all go in this textbook, obviously.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I think this
But
is and this is sort of, again, to show that this earlier debate in the early psychological literature was hitting on something as well, because some of those guys you could read as this naive idea that there's the data, which is sort of theory free, and then we go to it and then try to read off, use it as a support theory. But that's I think from a philosophy of science in the past 100 years or so, we could say has been a kind of debunking of that idea that there's such a thing as observation or theory free
yeah,
observation.
So recently I sort of chased some of this back, looking at these two explanatory pictures, these two
Descriptive.
pictures of science, the explanatory picture and the descriptive picture. Um, some of that goes back to Newton when they were discussing about, this was also new about using observation to theorize and how much to require that
Right.
observation delivers. And he had this very famous, I'm not going to say in Latin because I don't want to make a spectacle of myself, but I do not feign hypotheses.
Yes.
And that's been interpreted in these different ways that map onto some of the disputes in that area I was talking about, whether, um, I think it was about the theory of gravitation or something like that, whether that, Newton thought that that just was derived from observation,
Right.
or whether that was explanatory of it, but still had to mind the observation in really, really important ways. And so that was discussed right then and there. And you can find that discussion in terms of philosophy of science
Exactly.
running all the way through.
Yeah. Yeah. So that the Newton thing, I guess, the I posit no hypotheses or whatever, is what you're saying is that's often taken to be the idea that it's a mere description, not trying to explain what gravity is, but merely describing what it is, and that it's a different scientific pursuit to try to explain why that relationship holds, as opposed to merely describe it in terms of an equation that says this is what you will observe.
But it seems that Newton himself actually talked out of both sides of his mouth there, and there's support that he actually didn't think that it was merely descriptive. How could it be, right? You
Interesting.
couldn't get that force out of the observation, but that there was needed to be a very, very tight connection between that.
Okay, so that's the idea that there's something about the data that's pointing you towards the theory.
Yeah, and that you in developing your theory, in testing it, you need to develop it in concert with what you find and make sense of it, but also then you need to test it, right? So, and that was really also that was one interpretation of what he was saying there, and the other
Interesting.
one is much more radical.
Right, exactly. And
And
you see those carrying through this discussion that we've been
yeah,
having.
Wundt, for example, took the view that it was the former interpretation. So he has this lovely analogy for how psychology works with how science works more generally. He said, look, here, experimental observation delivers you exact description of the phenomena, just like, he said, Kepler and Galileo delivered with careful observation, the law-like regularities, the planetary motion and the whatever stone dropping.
Yeah.
I'm talking about. And then he said, but it took Newton's gravitational theory to really make coherent sense of.
To put the two pictures together.
Yeah, the first were just law-like exact descriptions of observation, of what happens.
Right.
And that's a huge step, and that shows the value of experimentation, he said. But it took the gravitational laws that go beyond to really do a scientific explanation.
Right.
And so that's how he thought about that.
Yeah, interesting. And that's why, you have that famous expression where they say Newton united heaven and earth under one set of equations or something. So taking these two realms were thought at the time to be really different in many different ways. I mean, the heavens being made maybe of a different material even, according to these guys. So it is quite an accomplishment. And it is also serving, I think, to remind us that the discussion that we've been having is one that you always have in the sciences, and that psychology is really no different in this respect except being started a little later, but from these other sciences, it's always been a question about what role does observation play and how do you build a theory in light of it. So it's been maybe some special little psychological spices here and there that make it unique or interesting. But it's of a general philosophy of science question that's been around for a long
Yeah.
time.
Yeah, right. So that's how I think about it. And then I think that the spice is quite big,
Yeah.
because we have this extra problem that what we're talking about is something that we seem to be able to get at partly only by getting subjects to do this thing. And then we're trying to be really crafty about getting observation that deploys subjects doing that.
Exactly. And I
Yeah.
also would wish that we would pay more attention to these early psychologists, and do them more justice, because I teach like a general psychology class, and the textbook we use is very breezy. It introduces like these early guys, and so at least there's that, they're in there, but everything's very condensed to a caricature that doesn't do
Yeah.
justice to how rich the discussion. And obviously, it's a huge field. You can't cover
Yeah.
everything, but at the same time, it really does set the tone. A lot of these issues come up again later in the class, so it would be nice to see more attention paid to this amongst people that are actually doing this stuff. But hopefully, you're part of a new and cool trend where philosophy and the science itself come together in this way. So.
Yeah. Yeah, there are lots of really great people who work on sort of, I mentioned Matthias,
Yeah,
and it's really fun to engage with. And Stephen Fleming too is there. There are lots of people who are interested
Yeah,
in those things. Yeah.
exactly. And he's a great scientist, but also he's a secret philosopher as well. I don't think it's much of a secret.
Not so secret.
Yeah, it's not so secret anymore. I was going to say it's not much of a secret, but but it is funny that in the book you have your faith-based optimist, but you don't have any sort of. There's no faith-based pessimism. So I was sort of just wondering at the end if you think the pessimism is more justified, at least initially, before you do all this work, than the optimism.
Oh, that's such an interesting question. It never occurred to me. I have some adjective for the pessimist as well, right?
Yeah, I don't recall
I
actually.
forgot, but otherwise they would be lopsided.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, I guess you're right. Maybe you're right that there's a kind of faith in, or at least maybe not faith, but there's a kind of antecedently committed.
Yeah.
So maybe it's more that there are some basic commitments that drive the pessimism, come what may, in some sense.
Right.
Whereas the optimist is faith-based in that they'll think like this will work itself out.
Right. If we just do a good enough job, someday it'll be figured out. But it's not that you think that the case for pessimism is stronger or something like that, or that that the case for
Again.
that maybe what I'm asking is, do you think that the default view should be pessimism until you go through all of this work that you've done, and then you can kind of be sort of an in-between optimist?
Yeah, temperamentally, that's definitely me. Right. So I'm much more concerned about worries that you might have. So, and I am coming from a very pessimistic. So my whole sort of the way things went for me was, you mentioned I was raised in the philosophy of perception land in when I was a graduate student in London. Lots of people were doing a philosophy of perception, and introspection was obviously used, and I had trouble. I couldn't do what they were doing. And so I am coming from a much more skeptical perspective off the bat at this, and then I had to work myself to thinking, well, being just a naysayer is really that's nothing, and you need to be, because you don't want to go all the way.
Right.
That's silly. So really, you should flip this around and think about how to draw the line constructively. And so, but that I was coming from the skeptical side.
I see. Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. So, but I think you make a good case for the non-faith-based optimism, the reason-based optimism. So I found it was this careful approach very refreshing, and I obviously am very interested, especially in the early psychologists and that whole literature. So I found that also very cool as just a separate little corner to be thinking about. So I really appreciate the project and the work that you do on it, and I really appreciate the time that you've taken to have this discussion with me today. So I want to say thank you for that. And if you just hang up for 1 second, I'll say bye off the air. But other than that, I want to just say thanks again for a really good conversation.
Thanks.
Okay, we